I'm going to talk about Python libraries for learning with sequence data. And so I work at Mount Sinai Medical School. I'm in the Hammer Lab, which is this collection of people here and a few others. And so we are not biologists. We work kind of in close cooperation with different biomedical research groups. We work with a vaccine core at Mount Sinai. We work with some clinicians. And the sort of conceit of the lab is that we are trying to leverage computer science in places where it's particularly useful for biomedicine. So we try to find collaborations where the missing ingredient is machine learning or managing a large collection of data, or there's already domain expertise that we can hook into and learn from, but we're going to sort of add a lot of value by being present. So we've been going for about 2 years, and we found some really good collaborations at Mount Sinai. And I'm going to talk about some of our applications that we work on and how that connects to deep learning over sequences. So the motivation for me getting started with this is that we are working on different projects related to cancer immunotherapy. And so this is kind of I don't know if you guys have paid attention to this, but it's a increasingly hot field. It's a very promising collection of therapies, some of which are personalized, some of which are generic, but they all involve using patient immune elements, the immune system of a patient, to in some way attack a cancer in that patient's body. So examples of these, the ones that are sort of better developed and more successful, are modulators of the immune system that make the immune system more aggressive and then cause it to attack cancer cells. And then sort of more interesting experimental kinds of treatments involve crafting personalized vaccines based on the mutational profile of a cancer. And that's a lot of what we've been working on is in that second category. But even in the better established therapies, there are a lot of questions around what exactly are the immune cells in a patient's body recognizing? Is it possible to predict what an immune system is responding to from the mutated protein content of a cancer? And so that actually raises a lot of machine learning problems, actually kind of well-posed machine learning problems out of what sounds like a really messy field. Like I think that cancer medical research is tremendously messy, and immunology is really complicated and messy. And it doesn't seem like the intersection of those two things would give you nice problems, but it actually does, which has been nice for me as someone getting started with cancer immunology with machine learning background. Problems often pop out that are easy to condense into a data set that you can learn over. So one particular problem of interest is if we know the mutated proteins in a particular cancer, can we predict which fragments of those are going to be recognizable by the immune system? So this sort of boils down to a regression task over short sequences. So proteins made out of lots of amino acids, and we're looking at fragments, little short sequences of those amino acids, and we want to predict different properties of those sequences. So the most interesting one for us is whether or not one of these protein fragments is going to stick to a thing called an MHC, which kind of looks like a catcher's mitt that holds up a little piece of a protein and sticks it on the surface of a cell. And then T cells come looking around and scavenging the surface of cancer cells. And if they have been trained to look for a particular pattern, they will kill that cell. And it's super cool to watch in video, and it's sometimes can make for really effective therapies. And so it's really important to know which protein fragments are going to be immune recognizable. And luckily, immunologists have been working for a couple decades now to assemble good data sets on these basic interactions. So isolate the parts of the recognition process that we can quantify, take different fragments of proteins and put them together with different MHCs, these little presentation platforms. And we have hundreds of thousands of examples of how well different fragments stick to different little catcher's mitts. I wish I had a diagram of the MHC to show you guys. So that's the motivation for how I got started with working with neural networks and deep networks and recurrent neural networks for immunological applications. And so one thing that jumps out of this problem is that there are certain kinds of prediction tasks where the range of sequence lengths are actually quite small. So there's certain molecules that have very strict profiles. They almost always want to stick to things that are 9 amino acids long, and sometimes 8 or 10, but it's very constrained. And so if you're working with sequences that actually don't vary much in length, they're almost always 9 characters long, then you're not really working with sequences. So very often you can get away with just transforming those into some vector space, and it becomes another generic machine learning problem. So this is a diagram of one of the predictors I've been working on, and it starts with a amino acid sequence and then maps it into, so there's just a vector embedding of each amino acid. And so you get this vector space that's the embedding size, 64, times this fixed length, which is 9. So you get a fixed vector per string, and you're not really dealing with sequence data anymore. Is that the source of the mysterious echo? All right. And so if you get a little bit of deviation from those lengths, you can often find ways to reduce your sequences down to the lengths for which you have a lot of data. So if you have mostly length 9 sequences and a few length 8, you can maybe find some reduction. Like, can you take out middle elements of the sequences and reduce all the 9s to 8s, or vice versa? Can you stick stuff in? And there's a lot of these tricks that if you have a lot of sequence data of the same length, you probably will have the most success making a fixed vector space representation and finding some way to stick the stragglers into the same representation. So we've had a lot of success with that. Other groups had a lot of success with that. So I think if you're doing sequence learning, it gets interesting once you have varying length sequences. So you have true sequence data in the sense that you might be learning over a corpus of text or full sequences of proteins or something where there's not one fixed simple vector representation to describe each sequence. And so there's traditional approaches to dealing with these kinds of data sets. So by far the most common is just to detemporalize the data. Find some way to count up occurrences, so bag of words or n-gram models, where you take your sequential data and say, well, count up how many times this pattern happens, and get a collection of patterns, and you sort of take things out of their sequential context. And often for things like topic modeling, or really where all you just care about is how often things are coming up, that's good enough, and you lose the temporal dependency in the data, and that actually helps you build better models, because maybe that temporal dependency never mattered in the first place. So another thing that people do, so I spent a very strange summer working in finance and making currency price predictors. And a lot of the features that I was making and ones I was using from other people were these weird sliding window features. So look at sliding windows over different time scales and then find ways to sort of craft lots of descriptors to try to summarize everything that's happening up to this point in time or around this point in time. And so there's a whole cottage industry of making these weird little descriptors. But it's all manual tweaking, and I don't know, it's not really a generalizable technique. It's a thing that for some problems you can get it to work. And then there's sort of more sophisticated techniques for dealing with sequence data. So conditional random fields and Markov random fields and various probabilistic models that work for specific tasks, but are kind of non-composable in the sense that you can't just use CRFs generically. Often if you get a CRF working for a new kind of task, that's a publishable element, because for a new task, inference was probably really hard, so you had to find some new approximation, and it's not, it lacks that sort of building block quality that neural networks have. And so there's this huge boom in deep learning around essentially how modular and composable the ideas are. That you can take convolutional neural networks and recurrent neural networks and stick them together and get captioning models, which is the thing that's harder to do if you work with more rigorous things like probabilistic models. OK, so I've explained why varying length sequences are hard and why existing approaches have some limits. So let's look at some things you can do within the neural network space. And so the simplest thing you can do is you just take a neural network that you feed it one sequence element at a time in some vector representation, and you loop back onto that same model its output from the previous time step. So you give it a character, it creates an output. You give it another character, it creates an output based on the last output and the current character. So this is a simple recurrent neural network. So the recurrence is that flow of the previous output as an input to the next state. And so these models have actually been around for a really long time. And they work in certain cases. So in cases where you have very short-range dependencies between the inputs and the output that you want to see. So if you have some continuously labeled sequence where the event of interest happens within a few time steps of some particular input, then a simple recurrent neural network can capture it. And so that is a nice extension. You can take whatever neural network you want and just loop its output back into itself. That works OK for some circumstances. It didn't really work in general, which is why these didn't take off. And so the problems with simple recurrent neural networks are centered around what happens when you get very long sequences. So if you have a sequence of 100 or 1,000 time steps, and you're trying to connect that a particular input 1,000 time steps ago is related to something that you need to identify now, it's very hard because typically the activation function in these neural networks is some nonlinear squishing. So you go through 1,000 steps of matrix multiply squish, matrix multiply squish, 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 and then you end up with this very, very faded signal from many time steps ago. So it's the presence of anything that happens in the far past is an infinitesimal part of what you have in your current state. And your whole memory in a simple neural network is just the current state, the current output. And so this also, when you try to chain backwards through the series of activations to train the neural networks, when you do backpropagation, because the effects of anything in the past vanishes, your gradients can also vanish. And then you also have the possible compounding of if you apply a function over and over again and it's growing a little bit each time, you can get exploding gradients. So your gradients can have norms that become sort of infeasibly large so that you can't learn anymore. So a simple recurrent neural network is not really appropriate for anything other than very well-constrained sequence problems. Short sequences, preferably with continuous labeling where at every time point you have an output, and very short delays between some event happening in the input space and some output that you want to see. So a key innovation in getting recurrent neural networks to work more generally actually happened a really long time ago. So it's this thing called the LSTM, the long short-term memory, I think. And so the first papers on the LSTM came out in the 90s, and they had a really neat innovation that so it was somewhat ahead of its time in that it's a model that works in general, but is fairly expensive, and the initial paper evaluates having nodes with like 2 LSTMs trying to learn very synthetic grammars, and that take like 20 hours to train on someone's 486. And so this entire family of models was revolutionary, but really not recognized for a long time until we had more computational capacity. And so what is cool about the LSTM, and there's other neural networks that have come since then that sort of exploit the same key feature, is they have a notion of gating. So the propagation of state from one step to another is sort of adaptively gated. It can turn on and off depending on the current state and the current input. The influence of the input in the previous state is not just this. So in a simple RNN, you have just the same mapping applied over and over again. You have your previous state and the current input, and then you get another state. So in this case, the default behavior is just to propagate state between time steps. So if your input is somehow uninformative, you can just imagine this as just copying its state from time step to time step forward forever. And then there's a adaptive update to the state, to this internal state, which is different than the output coming out of the node. So this internal state is sort of adaptively, you transform your input in the last state into a sort of hypothesis of here's how I'd like to update my hidden state. And then there's additionally, at the bottom, the little forget gate is also adaptively telling like how much of my previous state do I want to hold on to. So there's the sort of manipulation of memory is much more parameterizable. Instead of having the same deterministic mapping of your new memory is a fixed function of your old memory, instead you get these sort of degrees of freedom, parameters you can tweak that both craft the input into a proposal for a new state and also focus on when should you discard your old state versus hold on to it. And so this is a much more powerful model. It's really sort of you can think of it as like a continuized automaton. It's like a computational element. You can implement simple algorithms with it, but it has continuous parameters that you can learn through backpropagation. I'm going to pause there just to make sure people are with me. So let's have maybe like a open for questions moment. So
is this internal state, is there like another channel for it? Is it like another input?
So it's a vector, and you initialize it typically to 0, and then you update it based on its previous value and the current inputs. And then the output of this node goes up to deeper parts of the neural network. So there's sort of a separation relative to the simpler network I showed before. There's a difference now between the internal memory of this RNN unit of a layer and the output that it shows to deeper parts of the network. Other questions? It works perfectly fine with variable length sequences. There's implementationally, sometimes people try to stuff the input representation to be all fixed length, so maybe make vectors of length 200, and then you have to mask out the ones that are missing to accommodate varying length sequences. But that's really, it's kind of an affordance for when you do stuff on the GPU. It's often easier to have, instead of a collection of strings, just to make a big matrix. But as far as the learning algorithm, it really works over arbitrary length sequences. There are some questions about how far back through time do you want to try to backpropagate. So there's an efficiency issue. If you're learning something that reads an entire book and then emits a yes or no answer, first of all, you need a really big data set. But also, there might be some diminishing utility to scanning through the whole book and then backpropagating all the way back through the whole book. You might actually want it just to scan through most of the book until near the end, and then it'll have a little summary vector. Its internal state will summarize what it have read, and then you can do some steps of backpropagation towards the end. So there are questions of how truncated should backpropagation be going backwards in time. But the model itself will just, for every new token of your sequence, is going to update its internal state and emit a new output. And you give it another token, and it updates its internal state and emits a new output. And it does that for any length sequence. And you can generate infinite text that way. You can read infinite text that way.
Is there like a general rule of thumb between choosing between an RNN or an LSTM?
So you typically don't want to use an RNN unless you sort of know that your situation is well suited for it. So if you're doing time series regression and you have good labeling and you're trying to predict one time series for another, then it's possible that an RNN is well suited because you have close correspondence between what happens in one series to another. It sort of densely fills in the labels. But I think for most tasks, if you have enough data, it's preferable to use some gated model. So I'm showing the LSTM because I thought it'd be overwhelming to show lots of models, but there's another one called the GRU, the gated recurrent unit, that's also kind of interchangeable. And there's some other more experimental models that have been proposed, but they all have the same quality in that they have some sort of gating between 0 and 1. Usually it's a sigmoid, so it's like sort of, imagine you had like an on-off switch and you try to make it continuous, so you made just an adaptive sigmoid function that is switching how much you're updating your state. So it gives it some control over when it should update the state versus just keep propagating it forward. So if you have enough data to train those kinds of models, you need more data because they have more parameters, then you should probably use that kind of model. And so the rough rules of thumb are that you, for a largish 2-layer LSTM, you might want like a megabyte of text. And that's like very generic. It's like, like what does that mean? There's lots of different domains where like that means different things, but that's sort of roughly the scale that you want. Like you're not going to be able to train one of these models off of a single email. Right. Okay. So no, there's no whiteboarding required. So part of the power of these models is that the output coming from an LSTM layer is not necessarily the thing you're trying to label. It's just some other vector representation. So as you feed in inputs, you get a sequence of these output vectors. So you could be feeding in characters, and you get back 1,000-dimensional output vectors, which themselves can now be inputs to another LSTM. And that LSTM can also output vectors. Those could be 100-dimensional. And then eventually, you get to a place where you really just want to take, it depends on the task, but a common thing you do is you take the last time steps output vector as sort of a summary of everything that's happened. So you can imagine reading a sentence, and it goes through a 4-layer LSTM, and then your summary of the meaning of that sentence will be the last layer's last output. And that's sort of a basis for a simple machine translation model, because then you can take that meaning vector and use another LSTM to decode it into a different language. So there's a certain degree of summarization that's happening as you progress through a sequence.
When you're saying time here is not successive samples or sequences, it's successive elements.
Exactly, yeah. Any more? OK, all right, so let's go on. All right, so just in case you weren't intimidated by the last diagram, here are the actual update equations. And so the things that are just worth noting here is, so I don't think I labeled this really sufficiently, but so this is the forget gate. And just the thing to like, if it's a bunch of gibberish unless you look at it a couple times, but just notice that it's being squished with a sigmoid, continuous function between 0 and 1. And so you could think of anywhere you see a sigmoid, you could think of it as sort of, we wanted some sort of binary switch, but we can't learn binary logic from examples. So instead, we put a sigmoid in there because it's sort of the softened version of just a binary threshold. So in the places where you see sigmoids, you can think of those as places where you wanted just binary switches but couldn't have them. And then these tanh are sort of transformations between -1 to +1. And those are kind of like information we want to store. So we want to, things that we want to keep as either internal state or output to the next layer, we're going to squish to be between -1 and +1. And things that are supposed to be binary switches, we're sigmoiding. And then all these parameters, all these W matrices are different parameters within a single layer of an LSTM that you learn through backpropagation.
So say it again, the tanh is stuff that you want to save that's a real value.
It's a continuous value between -1 to +1. So there's sort of like units of memory or outputs that someone else will use, someone else being another layer. And the sigmoids are kind of things that we wanted to treat as binary switches but needed to make it soft. So C sub t is the internal state, the hidden memory of an LSTM unit at time step t. And so you can look at the update for the internal state is a function of how much of it you should remember, which is this forget gate ft. So if ft is high, then you remember a lot of your previous state. And if ft is low, then you forget it entirely. And then there's another switch, another continuized on-off switch of how much of your input should you look at, that I sub t is this an important input? And then there's some transformation of the input and the previous output to make a hypothesis of here's the kind of hidden state that we could generate from the current time step. So this is the kind of a proposal of this would be the kind of update I would make to your hidden state of this time step, but I might not apply much of it because IT will be low, and I might want to keep most of my previous memory. Or conversely, if you're doing language modeling, you hit a period, you'll find that ft often will be very low. So at the end of a sentence, you just want to clear your state, forget it. And the weight you afford to the input will be very high. So this is a way to sort of switch between how much of my input do I care about versus how much of my previous state do I care about.
Is there a reason why you are not using sequence function?
For which one?
CT.
Oh, why am I not re-squishing it? I'm not really sure. Yeah, that's a good question. Honestly, when I looked at it, it looked like a typo, but I got it out of Alex Graves's. Alex Graves is a researcher who works on this, so I'm trusting him on this being right, but it does look strange to not squish it. I kind of feel like there should be a tan H around the whole thing. Is there? There is in going to the output, but not for CT itself. So H sub t is the output going to the next layer. It's OK. It's a very technical detail. But I just wanted to give a general flavor of the kind of logic. So you have these like tanh parts that are trying to map into bits of information, and you have these sigmoidy parts that are trying to turn things on or off. OK, so I started with this very heavy-duty motivating example, which is predicting whether peptides stick to certain proteins for cancer immunotherapy. I was going to show more of that work, but I thought it might kind of go over people's heads, and I don't know if it's that accessible. So instead, I made a character-level language model for generating fairy tales, because I thought you guys might enjoy that more. So the source data, I downloaded Grimm's fairy tales from Project Gutenberg, which is it's about 500,000 characters, 69 of which are distinct. And so here's an example, I think, from the beginning is a certain king had a beautiful garden, and in the garden stood a tree, and it's a very repetitive style of text. So I thought this actually would be easy to learn with a recurrent neural network. And so the specific task that I'm using an RNN for here is language modeling. This is actually like one of the easier ways to train a recurrent neural network because you always have a label. You're not dealing with, sometimes you have tasks where you have a really long sequence and then a label at the end, and that's harder. In this case, you have every fixed number of characters, you ask it to predict the next character, and then you can penalize how wrong it was about what the next character is. So it's sort of like an easy RNN task. It's a gimme. And so the input in this case is I make a sort of hotshot encoding of every character. It's a 69 length vector, one of whose elements is 1. And then the output is a probability distribution. It's a softmax layer, which creates a probability distribution over possible next characters. And I'm penalizing it for all the probabilities it assigns that aren't on the correct next character. And so I wanted to show a couple different implementations. I started with Keras because it's what I'm using for other learning tasks, and I think it has a very nice API. So Keras is inspired by Torch, which is, so how many people in this room know Jan LeCun? This is a good fraction. So Jan's lab uses this library called Torch. I mean, they made it, and they also use it. And it's a very nice neural network API for Lua, and everything's great about it except that it's in Lua. And so I think that people were sort of jealous of the stuff that the Facebook AI lab could do with it. And so there have been a couple efforts to bring it over to Python, and Keras is, I think, the most successful Torch-inspired machine learning library. So it has a pretty clean API, and it has a lot of components that you want to use. So I'm going to recommend this as if you just want to get started with deep learning or recurrent neural networks, I would highly recommend doing things with Keras because it typically just sort of works straight out the gate. And so there's like a few things worth emphasizing here. So I have a layer sizes list, which just has how big all the layers should be. And I'm making a stacked LSTM. In this case, I just used 2 layers, both of which were size 256. And the first one needs to return all of its outputs at every time step. So this return sequences equals true means that every single time step, you should emit an output. So you make a sequence of outputs, which is then getting fed into, oh, this looks totally weird. This only works because there's 2 of them, I just noticed, because they should all return sequences equals true, except for the last one, whatever. So this is emitting an output vector per input character. And then there's a last LSTM layer, which is not returning its full sequence of outputs. It's just returning its single last output. And that is going into a softmax layer, which gives you a probability distribution over 69 characters. And then train with RMS prop, which is a really good default. It's a sort of adaptive stochastic gradient descent. It's a little more stable than just regular gradient descent. And then the penalty there at the bottom, you just say, I want categorical cross entropy, and it does the right thing. It makes an optimizer for you. So I think this is a very clean API. It's easy to play with. It's a little bit tedious if you want to do something new. So if you want to make a new kind of model, so you have some improvement over the LSTM that you want to implement, the sort of effort curve from using existing components that other people have implemented to making a new Keras component is extremely high, in my opinion. And it's very easy to break things. And the internal API of Keras is a mess, but the external API of Keras is awesome. So I also made an implementation in Lasagne, which is bigger. So Lasagne is a much more, so Keras really hides its under the hood components. Keras works as a wrapper around Theano, but it's a very thick wrapper. It protects you from Theano. You don't have to worry about mysterious errors. I don't know, who here has used Theano? Good number of people. I actually hate using Theano. I get these totally confusing tensor 544 is not the shape of tensor 3000 errors, and just I always like get stuck debugging this like simple line of code that I have no idea what's going wrong, because Theano is entirely its own compute engine. It's really a totally separate language. It's like declarative tensor language embedded inside of Python that then compiles stuff to the GPU and then fails for no clear reason. And so Keras hides that stuff from you. You typically get an error from inside of Keras instead of inside of Theano. Lasagne takes a much more, it's a little bit more like for adults. Like you know what you're doing, and you want to implement something novel, go ahead and do it. And there are just some helper functions inside of Lasagne for common neural network tasks. So you have rectified linear units, and there's all the optimizers have their own little. You give it a Theano element of some sort, and it gives you back another one that has been extended in sort of the right way. But you have to think in terms of Theano and build Theano functions and sort of do everything cognizant of Theano. And so you end up writing a lot more code, and I find it somewhat more error prone. But the plus side is that if you want to do something novel, if you got so into this stuff that you wanted to experiment with your own recurrent neural networks that differ from the standard ones, it's much easier to do it in Lasagne. And so the third implementation that I made is in Chainer, which is even more verbose. So Chainer does not use Theano. I find it to be much more debuggable, but it's the most verbose of all. So the basic logic of Chainer is actually kind of cool. So Theano, you define this whole compute graph, and then you just let Theano figure out what to do with it. Once it's all defined, then it runs some bulk optimizations, and then compiles some stuff and runs it for you. So the way the Chainer works is you define by running your code. So at every step, you have inspectable data that's much easier to debug. And it's keeping track of the computations that it used to generate that data. So at any point in the process, you ask it, okay, so now go backwards and give me the gradient for everything I've done up until this point. So it's much more like implementing things in NumPy. You can actually grab NumPy arrays at intermediate states of the computation, which is the thing you really can't do with Theano without a lot of effort. So that's nice, except it's really verbose. It doesn't help you out a lot. You have to implement everything kind of from scratch. So if you were particularly averse to Theano and you wanted to implement novel algorithms, I think Chainer is a good option. If you just want stuff to work, then you probably want to just write this instead. OK, so let's look at some output. So after one pass over the data set, I chopped up the text into length 50 strings. And then I'm predicting the 51st character from those first 50 characters. So this is like kind of like the dumbest, simplest RNN task. And so after one epoch, it sort of looks like Old English. It knows that there's consonants and vowels, and they follow each other, and there's spaces. And having learned just from characters, it could be emitting just underscores the whole time. So I'm already impressed with one epoch's worth of capacity.
And when
but
you say characters, you don't mean like a character as a person. You mean like an ASCII.
Yeah, like an ASCII character. I should say how I'm generating this, by the way. The way I generate it is I give it a random seed from within the text. So I'm not showing that part. And then I run it over that seed of 50 characters. It gives me a distribution over characters at the end. I sample from that distribution, extend the string, and then take the 49 previous characters plus the one new one and make that a new input, so another sequence that I run through the RNN. Then it gives me another distribution, so I sample from that, and I keep extending the string, building up this kind of gibberishy Old English thing. So that's after one epoch. So after two epochs, it's getting better. So it knows some words, her and she and said. It's still mostly nonsense, but the Bettel seat resent throw is almost like English. So skipping forward a bunch, so after 10 epochs, so the old woman is clacked upon his head, and mice cannot run off, and berought to Corterus, for the fisherman was that young gray back. And after 15 epochs, we get, the king came and said, give me a moon. Ah, said the wolf, the king was so well to go out to him. And after 40 epochs, we get, the bear was standing by the side of the stream and said to him, what a way into the forest, the golden house, if you have been the world. So it's doing a pretty good job. And it's capturing the really repetitive quality of these fairy tales. So if you go through the text, it's constantly, the king said something to the princess, and she went into the forest and said something to a bear. It really does kind of look like this. It's one pass over the full text file of all of Grimm's fairy tales. So each epoch takes, with Keras and Lasagne, it's about 500 seconds. And with Chainer, it's longer. It's maybe like 1,300 seconds.
Those are using the GPU.
Yeah, so those are, I'm pretty sure Chainer is using the GPU, because I think if you don't use the GPU, then it takes much longer. So I tried doing this on my laptop, which usually I'm really surprised by how a MacBook Air can sort of do anything. Like, the computers, I feel like there's some convergence where it doesn't matter if you have like a really skimpy laptop or like some, huge server. For the most part, I don't notice a difference, except when I'm doing deep learning work, where if you don't have a GPU, it's just effectively useless. I tried one epoch on my laptop, waited for a day, nothing happened, so I just gave up. So I'm running this all on a server with I think a last generation Tesla, some beefy, expensive GPU. OK, so that was fairy tale generation. And I'm going to show a couple other tasks you can do with this. This is not at all my work, so I'm just sort of showing you cool stuff people have done that has nothing to do with me. So one thing that's become really popular is using RNNs for machine translation. So this is an example of the simplest approach to doing that. Things have gotten pretty complicated. But the simplest idea is you take a sentence of one language, and you summarize it down to a single vector. So the RNN reads that sentence, and you take the last vector representing that sentence, sort of a meaning summary. And then you could use another RNN to then generate a sentence in the other language in kind of in a somewhat similar process to how I was generating those character strings. So the decoding RNN gives you a distribution over words that it thinks could be a reasonable thing to say at that point in time. So if you have this meaning vector and you've generated no words, what's the distribution of first words you should generate? And then once you've generated one word, you have some internal state signifying the one word you generated, and you still have the meaning vector you're trying to decode. So what's the distribution over next words you should generate? And so you could unspool these RNNs in that way to then make a whole sentence of English from German. And this actually works OK. Things have gotten more interesting with attentional mechanisms and sort of keeping track of which parts you haven't, which bits of meaning you haven't translated yet. But this is a totally reasonable way to do it. And I think even just this like simple idea of having an encoding and decoding RNN already was a big improvement over the state of the art before these things came into use. So another thing you can do is captioning. And so this is like a really cool example of the modularity of neural network ideas. So you can do really high quality object categorization and localization with convolutional neural networks. And you have RNNs, which kind of have this sequence text generating capacity. So what if you take examples of images that have text captions and train them together to try to make a sort of joint space of meaning over images and words. And then you could take a sort of meaning vector of just the image and then try to map it back into word space. So which words seem to be related to this image based on having examples of sequences and images together. So you take an image and a sequence and you map them together into some space, and then when you have one alone, you can find out which single words seem related to that image, or you could try to run the RNN back and get whole sentence descriptions of the image, which seems to work pretty well and is like a little bit spooky. I don't know if anyone's tried to use just the sentence to generate the image. That seems like it'd be really spooky. And then the things that I care more about, there's a lot of applications in computational biology that are, the field is like just catching on to deep learning. So there was one really high profile paper in splice prediction. And so you have DNA, and when it's transcribed into RNA, it gets cut up. So which places get cut up is a hard prediction problem. There were some really heuristic, simple models for what gets spliced that never work that well. And I think there's been one serious effort using recurrent neural networks to predict splice sites, and that worked much better. And so other things that people care about that haven't been really like solved well, but probably will be solved with RNNs, are sites of cleavage of a protein. So you have these different proteases in the proteasome that cut proteins up, and it's really useful to know where they do it. And right now what we have is really simple heuristics of like, these amino acids tend to be the ones that come before a cut, but it's not very predictive. So I think that those kinds of tasks will probably be much better served if you get a big data set of, I started with these couple proteins and these are the peptides I could identify afterward. You could train an RNN to identify what the cutting sites could be. And then the thing that I'm working on now is that last point, which is when you have a really long protein fragment, is it going to bind to an MHC that presents it to the immune system? That's the whole talk.